morning. I'm delighted to have been invited to speak at your conference here this morning. In the time available, I want to cover three things. First of all, how can well-being influence policy? How can well-being be linked to better outcomes? And how can citizens become more actively engaged in well-being measures? To start off with, I just want to give a little bit of a background to provide context. When I joined the National Economic and Social Council in 2007, my first project was to produce a social report for Ireland. And as I started to work on this project, I found that other organisations were already producing statistics that could be collated as a social report. And indeed, the CSO publication measuring Ireland's progress, which many of you might be familiar with, is such a report. So I thought, how am I going to add some value there? And I came upon the evolving well-being literature and the arguments for measuring other aspects of society's progress in addition to GDP. So this sparked my interest as being an important contribution to social reporting, including how subjective well-being measures can support and complement existing objective indicators. Some people may know of the NESC report that was published in 2009, Wellbeing Matters, a social report for Ireland, and I'm going to draw on some of that work today. But since then, of course, there have been many developments in this field, including the influential report by the Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress that was authored by Joseph Stiglitz and his colleagues, as well as the current programme of work that's been produced by the Carnegie UK Trust. While working on other projects in NESC, unfortunately I don't have the luxury of working on wellbeing full-time, but I've stayed engaged in this important debate through work with Mike Hogan and his colleagues in the University of Galway, and also involvement in the Roundtable on What Matters in Northern Ireland, and also through the board of the National Statistics Board, who are obviously responsible for setting the compilation and development of official statistics here. So it's on that basis that I make my observations this morning. So first, how can well-being influence policy? The Carnegie UK have considered this issue and published their report Shifting the Dial from Wellbeing Measures to Policy Practice in 2012. Some of you may be familiar with that. Based on 4 case studies, they identified 3 areas for action: visible leadership, to continue to develop practical means of using wellbeing data, and to mobilise a wellbeing movement. Unfortunately, this report wasn't available when I was undertaking my work on well-being. And so at that time, I considered the issue in 3 stages: policy design, policy implementation, and policy monitoring. So if we look at the first stage of policy design, how can we encourage policy designers and legislators to take the broader aspects of well-being into account when they're developing a policy and deciding between options? In the NESC report, I considered a well-being test, which was essentially a set of questions that could be asked at the policy design stage and could potentially align policies more closely to a well-being agenda. And there were 6 criteria in the well-being test, and I'll just briefly go through these. The first one is capability. So to what extent will the policy focus on what an individual can do with a view to developing their capabilities? Agency. To what extent does the policy respect the capacity of individuals to make decisions about their lives? Purpose. To what extent does the policy recognise the importance of having a sense of purpose by encouraging and supporting people to engage in meaningful activity? Social interaction, and Ivan spoke about this. Does the policy recognise that we operate not as individuals, but in the context of a set of relationships within families, within communities, and within wider society? The common good. As individuals and societies, we do better in more equal and fair societies, as demonstrated by various researchers. But to what extent does the policy promote the common good? And sustainability. As we live in a finite world, to what extent does the policy use our resources wisely now and for future generations? So maybe just for the discussion, do we think this approach could be useful in policy design? Could it be operationalized? So just then to move on to the second stage is policy implementation. And there's now a greater awareness in Ireland of the difficulties in implementing policies according to their design, with some commentators referring to an implementation deficit. Often this can be underlain by a resistance to change, and difficulties in implementation reflect the importance of having clear objectives, good leadership, and the involvement of people who are delivering the policy at the front line and those in receipt of it being involved in the design. These elements were recognised by Carnegie and are also suggested in the wellbeing test I've just described. The third stage is policy monitoring, and this is where most of the attention by wellbeing advocates has been focused. Questions which come to mind are, what indicators should we use? Who decides? How are they measured? How are they presented? What do they tell us about the policy? How can they inform change? I'm sure some of these things will be picked up during the day, but it brings me to the second point I want to make, second main area. How can well-being be linked to better outcomes? I think this is a challenging area as well, because we're prone to focus on inputs and activities rather than on outputs and outcomes. And outcomes in particular are notoriously difficult to measure, especially with regard to establishing causal relationships. And again, Ivan touched on that. Nevertheless, the measurement of outcomes should be more than an ambitious aspiration. If we really want to embed well-being into public policy, we need to think hard about what outcomes we want and then how we might achieve them. And the Scottish Government has given some thought to this with their Scotland Performs initiative, and that measures and reports on the progress of government in Scotland. The national priorities are set out in a national performance framework, which is a single framework to which all public services in Scotland are aligned. The framework is based on delivering outcomes that improve the quality of life for people in Scotland rather than on inputs and outputs only, and it's based on an assessment of Scottish national well-being. And that brings me to the third area. How can citizens be more actively engaged in well-being measures? Many indicators of well-being have traditionally been drawn up by experts based on surveys and other data. But who should decide on what national well-being should look like? What should the priorities be? I think this is really where subjective well-being can sit alongside objective measures of social progress. And many governments have been taking initiatives in this regard by asking citizens their views. As mentioned by Ivan, the Office of National Statistics in the UK has carried out a national debate and public consultation exercise on what matters to you in terms of people's well-being. In Canada, the development of the Canadian Index of Wellbeing was informed by extensive public consultations across Canada. The Stiglitz report referred to earlier advocated the establishment of roundtables at national level involving stakeholders to identify and prioritise indicators for a shared view of social progress. And the Northern Ireland Roundtable is an example of this approach. Mike Hogan and his colleagues in Galway have piloted a computer-assisted interactive management methodology with local stakeholders there to identify key well-being objectives. And this methodology, I think, has the potential to be used more widely. So in conclusion, it seems to me that it's important to engage citizens in helping to identify national priorities and to be involved in policy design and implementation. And where there is such engagement, it should lead not only to better informed policies, but also encourages buy-in in their implementation. Such an approach could provide a context for considering issues of inequality, which we'll be considering further throughout the day. Thank you.